There's something strange about the way Americans remember summers before air conditioning. They were hot, sticky, sometimes hot enough that people gave up on their beds altogether and slept outside. But when Americans look back on those summers, the heat usually isn't the first thing they mention. They remember a fan running all night, the Iceman's truck rolling down the street, chairs dragged out to the porch after supper, whole families lying under the stars because the upstairs bedrooms were simply too hot to bear. It wasn't that summer was easier back then, it was that the whole house, the daily rhythm, and sometimes the entire neighborhood was organized around living with the heat instead of fighting it. Here's what one of those days looked like. From sunrise to well past midnight, somewhere in America in the late 1940s or early 1950s. Early morning. Before the sun had any real bite to it, Dad was already moving room to room, pushing windows up one by one. Mom followed behind, unlatching the screen doors. The youngest one in the house was usually the first to notice, a breeze slipping in through the gap, cool against the skin before anyone else caught it. Still half asleep, the child was suddenly wide awake. Houses back then were built to breathe. Windows on opposite walls created a cross draft that pushed hot air out and pulled cooler air in. Even the little transom windows above bedroom doors stayed open, letting warm air circulate instead of settling in the rooms where people slept. The night before, that same kid had drifted off to lace curtains, stirring with every gust. Crickets outside, a dog barking somewhere down the block, and every so often a freight train rolling through town well after midnight. For a lot of families, a breeze like that was the best comfort they'd get all day. Midday. By the time the sun hit its peak, the whole rhythm of the day shifted. Farmers had already been out in the fields before dawn. In many homes, mothers tried to finish the baking, ironing, and heavier cooking while the morning air was still bearable. But by early afternoon, most of that stopped cold. Gardening stopped. Any chore that could wait until evening did. Nobody had to tell the kids to find shade. They just knew to duck under the nearest big maple, stretch out in the grass, and wait out the worst of it. Summer clothes got lighter too. Cotton, linen, thin seersucker that let air move against the skin instead of trapping heat. Men rolled up their sleeves and loosened their collars. Women wore loose cotton dresses that caught every bit of breeze. And once the kids reached the backyard, their shoes usually came off. Bare feet on cool grass was one of those small pleasures a lot of people still remember clearly decades later. Nobody called it a strategy. It was just common sense. Fighting the hottest part of the day only wore you out faster. Early afternoon. This was when the heat really started to bite. Not every family had an electric refrigerator yet, which meant the Iceman was still a familiar summer visitor in many neighborhoods. The kids heard his truck before they saw it, then heavy boots on the sidewalk and the clang of iron tongs as he hooked another block. With a thick leather pad over one shoulder, he'd carry 50-pound blocks of ice like he'd been doing it his whole life. The kids would stand on the porch watching, hoping for a chipped-off sliver before he moved on to the next house. Pressing a piece of ice to your face on a 90-degree afternoon was the kind of feeling a child could remember for the rest of a lifetime, even if it left the fingers aching. But ice could only keep the icebox cold and the drinks bearable. It couldn't cool down the whole house. So, when the heat got truly unbearable, some families headed to the coolest place in town, the movie theater. As far back as the 1930s, theaters proudly advertised cooled air, sometimes almost as big a draw as whatever was playing. Families bought tickets less for the film and more for that wall of cold air the second they walked through the doors. Department stores caught on fast too, and plenty of people suddenly found reasons to browse a little longer than they needed to. For years, especially in small towns and rural areas, the movie theater may have been the only place many families regularly felt anything close to real air conditioning. Late afternoon. The sun started to ease off, though the heat hadn't quite let go yet. Water turned the whole neighborhood into a playground. If there was a pond, a creek, or some swimming hole only the neighborhood kids knew about, that's where you'd find them. In town, a sprinkler turning on someone's lawn could hold a group of kids for an entire afternoon. That steady tick, tick, tick was practically the sound of summer itself. And every kid knew exactly when to leap through the stream, timing it just right to avoid getting soaked. In some city neighborhoods, fire hydrants were opened on the worst days, sending children racing through the water. Shoes disappeared somewhere. Clothes got soaked through. Grass and mud stuck to bare feet. And nobody much cared. If you got thirsty, you grabbed the garden hose, took a long drink, and ran straight back into it. Then the sun went down, and everyone faced a different problem. How do you sleep in a house that's held onto every bit of the day's heat? Before we get to that, tell me in the comments, what did your family do to get through the hottest nights? Run a window fan, sleep on the porch, or leave every window in the house wide open? I'd love to hear your memories. Evening into night. After supper, almost nobody wanted to stay inside. Dad dragged the rocking chair out to the porch. Mom poured iced tea or lemonade. The kids chased fireflies across the yard, and neighbors just wandered over without needing an invitation. No one needed to be told what the weather was doing. They could feel it on their skin. Long before television and central air made evenings indoors more comfortable, the front porch was where the whole block gathered every summer evening. If a family had an electric fan, it ran almost around the clock, on that steady hum in the bedroom from June clear through September, sometimes rattling a little from a slightly bent blade. But nobody minded as long as the air kept moving. On especially miserable nights, some families set a pan of ice in front of the fan, hoping the air passing over it would bring a little relief. And some nights, even the fan wasn't enough. Whole families dragged mattresses out to screened sleeping porches, or spread blankets across the backyard. Kids lay there whispering to their brothers and sisters, pointing at constellations they couldn't name, listening to tree frogs, crickets, and every so often a freight train rumbling somewhere in the dark. Every now and then, a cool breeze would drift through the yard, and everyone would smile, because that meant they might actually sleep. Looking back, a lot of people still count those among some of the most memorable nights of their childhood. Not because the ground was comfortable, because the memory was. Summer before air conditioning was never easy. People sweated through long afternoons, searched for shade, and waited for every small breeze they could get. No one who lived through those summers would pretend the heat was pleasant. But it pushed everyday life outward, onto porches, into yards, and into public places where neighbors naturally crossed paths. Instead of sending everyone into a separate room with a remote in hand, what do you remember most? A fan humming in the dark? The Iceman's truck? Or a whole family sleeping under the stars? Leave your memory in the comments. Sometimes the stories shared there are even more powerful than the ones in the video. And if this video just took you back to a summer you thought was long gone, subscribe to Old American Unspoken. There are still many more memories from America's past waiting to be told.